Hi, good evening. So, as the opening frame of this evening's episode shows, I'm going to be getting back to some more reflections on the National Education Policy of 2020. And this evening, in a short episode, I want to be talking about the really critical and foundational period of all education, which is called as early childhood care and education. So, the early years last a lifetime, it is said. And this is something that has been emphasized again and again and again and has literally been drilled into us, working in the field of education, interested in the early years, by people who have worked in this field for many decades and who have immense experience and knowledge and insights about what is it that makes the early years so important. So it is said that the early years last a lifetime, and it is in these early years that the true and lasting foundation for later learning and development in human beings is really laid. So there's a continuum of processes that begin from the earliest years right all the way through adult development. And if we don't get this right, because it is said that the earliest years last a lifetime, if we don't get this right, then we have to pay for this folly, we have to pay for this oversight, and it results in what people call as deficits in development. So children who have not had a wholesome enabling early childhood have problems when they go to school, and that again has a domino effect. It continues later on in school, in high school, higher education, in adult life. So if a very simple example, if children are not growing up in an environment which values them as human beings, in which there's sensitivity, care, and in which their creative potential is encouraged, all of these later come back. In fact, sometimes come back in very harsh and brutal ways in terms of disabling that individual's capacity for love, for social interactions, for a full flowering of creativity, and so on and so forth. So and of course all of this is not anecdotal. What I'm sharing is not impressionistic. There's a lot of global evidence that has been accumulated over the last several decades, which shows to us why the early years are important. I'm not also suggesting that if we miss the bus in the early years, then we are losing everything. But then it becomes that much more difficult to come back and make up for all those losses and all those deficits. So what does this document say about those early years? And is it comprehensive? Can we now say we have a sound approach to things moving forward in the next 10, 15, 20 years? So this is what I'll be reflecting upon in this short episode. I think the first part of this section, in fact this comes under the section called school education, and I'm coming a little later to the role of school education in this. So the first thing that one notices about this policy is what is called as the 5+3+3+4 scheme, which is a departure from the earlier scheme, which basically had a 10+2 structure, 10 years of schooling and 10+2 years of pre-university. And in the earlier structure, the preschool part of it, that's for the ages 3 to 5 or 5+, was not seen to be part of the education department or the education ministry's jurisdiction. It was part of another ministry called as the Ministry for Ministry of Women and Ministry for Women and Child Development. So the first shift is that the 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4, the 5 includes 3 years of preschool, in which children attend a preschool, whether it's a private preschool. In government parlance, of course, they're called as Anganwadis or Balwadis. And there's also a Balvatika stage, which is like a school preparedness kind of a phase within this block of 5 years. So the first 3 years are for preschool, and the next 2 years are for grades 1 and 2. And then the 3 years after that, that's the 5 plus 3, is for the classes 3 to 5, which is like the middle of primary school to the end of the primary stage. And then we had the middle school, which is classes 6 to 8, and after that we have the secondary school, which is classes 9 to 12. Now this has been done ostensibly to create a continuum from the earliest years to the secondary level. But then it also raises an issue which I want to talk about as we go along. So what are the other key elements of this policy's observations and take on early childhood care and education? This is basically between the sections 1.1 to all the way up to 1.9. This is the place where early childhood education, care and education are described in a fair amount of detail. The first point that I want to make is, like I did in the last episode, my first episode on the national education policy. Just a minute. Yeah, the first point that I would like to make is that there is absolutely no reflection of what has happened over the last several decades and what are the learnings, right? For example, a statement is made under 1.1 that presently quality ECCE is not available to crores of young children, particularly children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. Why is this so, even after so many decades of educational policies starting from 1968 to 2020, more than 5 decades? I think we would have benefited from that critical discussion, and of course, ignoring all of that, ignoring what has happened, what are the gains that we have made, what is the ground that needs to be covered, what are the things that have worked well, where are the mistakes, what kind of mistakes have we committed? All of that is missing. So it's in a sense, this entire section is located in a vacuum, like the overall policy appears to be located in a vacuum, right? Of course, it talks about by 2030 that all students entering grade 1 are school ready. I mean, that's the first point that it makes, after acknowledging that many children are not getting quality ECCE. It might sound as if I'm nitpicking, but then I think, do we really want children to be ready for schools, or do we want schools to be ready for children? I think it may sound like a bit of a play with language, but it is not. So we actually would like children to be schools to be ready for children and welcoming for children, and not children to be ready for schools in whichever way they are. I think that's the small point but important point that I want to make. In 1.3, this policy talks about a sub-framework for the 0 to 3-year-olds. Now, surprisingly, there is absolutely no reference in this document to a national policy on early childhood care and education in 2013 that was brought out by the UPA government, UPA 2, which also laid a lot of emphasis on the 0 to 3 year subgroup within the ECCE group. So the group under which we talk of ECCE is from birth to 6 years age generally, and then we also talk of the 0 to 3 age group and the 3 to 6 years age group separately. There's no reference to this policy. So somewhere, as I said in the last episode of mine, this document does not acknowledge the things that have come before it. It is almost as if, it looks as if, things are being started all over again. So therefore, ignoring the earlier policy and the framework that was developed for early childhood care and education, this policy talks about another national curricular and pedagogical framework for ECCE up to the age of 8, and this will be developed by the Apex National Council for Educational Research and Training, NCERT, which is basically a body that comes under the Ministry of now Education and till very recently the Ministry of Human Resource Development. The sub-framework for the 0 to 3-year-olds was also enunciated in the national policy of ECCE in 2013. What is it? What is that sub-framework over here? We'll have to wait and see. There are no details. Is this for parents? Because children under 3 years do not attend any institutional form of preschool education. So are we talking of parents over here? And how are we going to do it, and so on? Those details are basically missing, and understandably so, because they've already said that they'll develop a separate document. So let's wait and see what happens. Under 1.4, they talk about the equity aspect in terms of paying attention to districts and locations that are socially and economically disadvantaged. One good thing that I see over here is they're looking at a mix of standalone Anganwadis, because the Anganwadi is already there. Anganwadi is co-located in primary school. So in some states there are Anganwadis that are in the same school complex, and therefore they are co-located, and that offers a certain different kind of advantage because they're in the same place, and in terms of continuity and so on. And then there are, it also talks about a pre-primary school or section covering the age of 5 to 6 years co-located within primary school. So the moment a child comes to the age of 5, it gets into this pre-primary section. And of course they mention that all of which would recruit workers, teachers, specially trained in curriculum and pedagogy of ECC. Now, the question that needs to be really looked at upfront is, what is the status of the Anganwadi worker or this ECC worker? Are we going to equate this worker with the primary school teacher? Because so far one of the problems that we have faced, and this has come up for in discussions for so many years now, is that the Anganwadi workers are never really considered to be the employees of the state. They're not considered to be the staff of the education department. They're always considered to be on contract, and therefore their payments and remuneration and so on are far, far lower than what school teachers get. Some states have increased it on their own, but then those are the exception, then they are not the norm. So when we expect so much from the ECC worker who works with young children, foundational years, the critical years lasting a lifetime, why shouldn't we elevate this worker, most of whom are women, in fact all of them, to the status of a teacher and give them the benefits that the teachers enjoy as full-time employees of the education department? I think there's no reflection on that. It's kind of given a pass. Of course, they talk about high quality infrastructure, play equipment, well-trained Anganwadi workers and teachers. And again, the question is, haven't we been doing it for years? Haven't we been trying to train Anganwadi workers for years, as we've been trying to train teachers? Where have we gone wrong? What needs to be done differently, and so on? What happens to the entire set of Anganwadi worker training colleges, the mid-level worker colleges and so on that are part of the system? Do they get a revamp? Are they going to be closed? And given the large number, the lakhs, and more than 1 million, I think, I think there are probably about 1.5 to 2 million Anganwadis. So therefore, as many Anganwadi workers, how are they going to be trained? What is the structure for that? And in what time frame is that going to happen is not clear. In 1.6, there is a mention of an ECCE qualified teacher who will look at this Bal Vatika phase of grade age 5 to 6, as I said, the pre-primary stage. But is this ECCE qualified teacher going to be on the same level as the primary teacher? That's the question, and there is not much reflection on that in this particular document. Of course, then it goes on in 1.7 to talk about how these ECCE teachers in Anganwadis are going to be trained, how the current Anganwadi workers are going to be trained. The framework is going to be developed by NCERT, and they'll use a range of digital distance modes using DTH channel as well as smartphones and so on and so forth. And the entire training of these Anganwadi workers and ECCE teachers will be overseen by the education department. And there'll be continuous professional development. So our learnings, the lessons that we have learned in the past several decades is that Anganwadi workers are not trained enough, they're not trained well enough, and they're not trained continuously. Though there's no notion of continuous professional development in the system at all. In fact, several Anganwadi workers that I've met over the last several years tell me that after their initial induction training, when they become Anganwadi workers, they're often not trained for the next 5, 10, 15 years. They're just expected to do a job. So how we are going to overcome that, and why we haven't overcome that in all these years, I think needs to be looked at, and there's no reflection on this. Strangely, in point 1.8, the point number 1.8, ECCE will also be introduced in ashram shalas in tribal dominated areas. So ashram shalas are residential schools. Now I don't understand why children who are so young and below 5 years of age should be moving out from their families, leaving their parents and coming into these ashram shalas. Ashram shalas as well as all formats of alternative schooling, it says. So it's a little worrying that we are talking about children staying in residential facilities at such a young age. The last point that I want to mention is, I think this is a huge departure in this policy from the earlier policy, which is that the entire business rules or the entire business of or the enterprise, I should say, of early childhood care and education is now going to be shifting to the education department. It was still, this policy came into vogue. It was with the Ministry of Women and Child Development, MWCD as we called it, or the WCD at the state level. That entire responsibility is now going to be taken over by the school education department. Of course, it mentions that there will be joint efforts by the Ministry of Education and Women and Child Development, Health and Family Welfare and Tribal Affairs, but it is very clear, as is said in point 1 in 1.9, the responsibility for ECCE curriculum and pedagogy will lie with MHRD. In fact, it uses the earlier term of MHRD, which has now become Ministry of Education, MOE we should say, to ensure its continuity from pre-primary school to primary school and to ensure due attention to the foundational aspects of education. I don't know, personally I feel that there is really no value in this, in the sense that prior to I think 2006 or around 2006 or 7, MHRD, Ministry of Human Resource Development, which is now Ministry of Education, was looking at pre-primary education. It wasn't so much called as ECCE at that point of time, but in 2007 or 8, that was shifted to the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Now 13 years later, 12 to 13 years later, you're switching it back to the MHRD. Now one reason could be that we want all of education, starting from the earliest years to the secondary and higher education, to be under one ministry. But then I think the Ministry of Women and Child Development over the last 12 to 13 years has really done a lot of work in this domain. And I'm not sure, if I were somebody in the Ministry of Women and Child Development, I'm not sure if that ministry would take this easily and if they would be happy in letting this go, because they have institutionally learned how to do it. I think the point over here is doing things better, learning from past mistakes. And this shifting from one ministry to the other is not automatically going to improve the quality of ECCE. It depends on so many other factors, including political will, mindsets, learning from past mistakes, and so on. So that is not so much happening over here. There's a clear departure, but whether it will accrue any advantage to the young child in the future, only time will tell. So these are some of the points that I would like to make. The overarching point being that unfortunately it looks to be written in a large vacuum, not acknowledging what has happened before, not looking at lessons that we have learned,